couple of the playoff losses this postseason for the LA Kings were among the most disappointing in franchise history. That and more on this edition of Locked On LA Kings.
You are Locked On Kings, your daily podcast on the Los Angeles Kings. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey, Kings fans, welcome to Locked On LA Kings, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Thanks for making Locked On LA Kings your first listen every day. We are free and available wherever you get your podcasts and on YouTube. I'm Eddie Garcia, your host of Locked On LA Kings. I've worked in sports media for the past 30 years, also co-host of Locked On NHL Game Night, a nightly podcast and YouTube show that wraps up the night in the NHL, new episode out now, and a passionate LA Kings fan for over 30 years. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Right now, new FanDuel customers can get $200 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. Well, as we navigate this offseason, we have obviously looked at what's been going on with the LA Kings, hiring a new GM. We've talked about some of the moves the Kings might be making this offseason, looked at some of the free agents available, and put a spotlight on Kings players from this past season and looking ahead to next year. We will continue to do much more of that as the season goes along, but it is the off season and we have time to try some other things. And that includes talking about some of the history of the Los Angeles Kings and how current history might fit into that. And maybe it's too soon to look at something like this, but it has been something that for whatever reason, I have been thinking about a lot. With the playoff series the Kings just went through, how bad was that exactly? What are some of the most disappointing losses in Kings playoff history, and how might a few of those games this postseason fit in there? And for sure, we could all be prisoners of the moment. I can definitely be that. These wounds are fresh, and they hurt more than the old ones, but I hate to say it, I think this playoff series loss to the Oilers is one of the worst, maybe the worst in franchise history. Obviously, this is a subjective list that I put together. It's my list. It may not be your list, but I tried to take into account the history of the organization, not just my own personal feelings. So I have compiled a top 10 list, and we'll see what you think about this. Now, I like to think at my age that I have matured and gotten wiser, and I have a better grasp of what's important in life. I try to make my passion for sports enjoyable and not a source of stress, but that's something that's not completely in my control. You can't really unplug yourself. And what fun would that be anyway? Honestly, part of the thrill of sports is kind of going through the ups and downs. And, you know, as I've gotten older, I think I am able to kind of let go of disappointments a little bit easier than I did when I was younger. But I also think that kind of feeling is kind of why I decided to kind of explore this. So real quick, story time with Uncle Eddie. There was a loss for the postseason, this postseason for the Kings, and it took me back to when I was a much younger man. We will go in the Wayback Machine to 1992. I was a freshman in college, and I was very much into sports, like crazy into sports. Now, when I was growing up, 10 years old in Central California, we really didn't have any kind of geographical allegiance to Northern or Southern California. You would see Dodger fans, you'd see 49er fans. We were kind of, 300 something miles away from LA, 300 something miles away from the Bay Area. So there wasn't really, you had to root for this team or you had to root for that team. So again, the year was 1979. Yes, I am that old. And that year, the Pittsburgh Steelers and the Pittsburgh Pirates both won world championships. The Steelers NFL, the Pirates Major League Baseball. And I decided as a 10-year-old, those are going to be my teams. Don't tell anyone. I even flirted with being a Penguins fan for a little while, but that didn't stick. Anyway, one of those decisions worked out very nicely. The Steelers have been one of the best franchises in the NFL for a long time. And the other one, not so much. The Pittsburgh Pirates are pretty much a joke of a franchise. So back in 1992, though, the Pirates actually at that time were trying to win, and they were 1 out away from going to the World Series. They were in Atlanta taking on the Braves, and they allowed 3 runs, and they lost the game with a walk-off single. Sid Bream, one of the slowest men in all of baseball, scored from second base on a single to left field, and Barry Bonds could not throw him out at home plate. And I was furious. I was devastated. I was angry. Now, I'm not going to get specifically into what I did in the immediate aftermath of that disappointment, but there were some repairs necessary to some furniture, and I am not proud of that. But that did happen. And that anger, that feeling, that disappointment has stuck with me all these years. I still can remember that moment very vividly. And I even kind of laugh about it now because I don't watch baseball anymore, really, maybe the playoffs. And I really don't support the Pittsburgh Pirates anymore. I've taken the stance now with that franchise. If they don't care, why should I care? And they're not trying to win. So I don't really, it's funny. The angriest I've ever been at a sporting event involves a sport I don't really watch anymore and a team that I don't really support anymore. But anyway, fast forward to this year, game 4 against the Oilers, a blown lead, an overtime loss. And yes, there have been other sporting events that I've been upset about or disappointed in through the years. But this one hurt so much. It took me back to that moment in college. I had not been that angry since that moment in college. And I had to scream, which I did. I screamed a word that starts with the letter F. And I had to throw something. It was a hat I was wearing, a Kings hat at the time. Now, there was no broken furniture this time. There was nothing like that. But like I said, I had not felt that kind of disappointment in a very, very long time. So it took me back to that moment years and years and years ago. Now, as an older Kings fan, going through some of the really tough moments that I have gone through with this team, to see them finally win the Stanley Cup, because you go through all that stress and all that disappointment, it did make that a lot more special. And it sucks when your team has tough seasons and tough losses. But I do believe that if you are a fan that endures the good times and the bad, it makes the good times that much more sweeter. I mean, anybody can jump on a bandwagon when a team's doing good, but those people aren't the true diehards. The diehards are there through the good times and the bad times. So if there are maybe some newer fans that are listening or watching this, maybe you weren't around when the Kings won their Stanley Cups in 2012 and 2014. These losses obviously hurt. This is not fun to go through, but hopefully one day the Kings will rise again and win another championship. And if they do, these tough times of late will make that even more special. Of course, the bad thing is there is no guarantee that the Kings will ever win again. My poor wife is still waiting for her Chargers to win a Super Bowl, and I hope that sincerely happens for her someday. And if it does, all those disappointments she's gone through for years and years and years, seeing all those tough losses will make that moment, if it ever happens, that much more sweeter. So I guess this is my way of saying, yes, what has happened recently with the LA Kings sucks, but if you stick with it, endure, keep hope alive, hopefully we will see some more amazing moments soon. But now let's talk about the worst playoff losses in LA Kings history. We're going to do that next. You're on Locked On LA Kings, your team every day. The NBA playoffs are in full swing, and every night delivers highlight-worthy performances, major momentum shifts, and can't-miss moments. Whether it's a game-winning shot or a breakout player, there's never been a better time to get in on the action. FanDuel makes it easy to stay in the game before tip-off and during the live event with player props, performance trends, and same-game parlays. Fans have more ways than ever to play smart and win big. Which players showing up in the biggest moments, and how could tracking their trends help you build your next big bet? What would it look like to combine live prop bets mid-game based on how the action unfolds? If you've got a read on who's heating up, why not back it up with a same-game parlay? Could a $200 bonus in bets add to the excitement if your first $5 bet hits? New to FanDuel, it's the perfect time to sign up. Head to FanDuel.com, place your first $5 bet. If it wins, you get $200 in bonus bets. Make every moment more with FanDuel, the official sports betting partner of the NBA. All right, so let us count down the top 10 most disappointing losses in Kings playoff history. Let's go with number 10, the 1968 playoffs, first round, Game 7 in Los Angeles. This is the first season in the history of the Los Angeles Kings, and I think all the teams made it into the playoffs that first year. I think there was 12 teams. One division was like the original 6, and then the other division was all the expansion franchises. I think that's how that went. Anyway, the Kings did play in a Game 7, and they lost to the Minnesota North Stars 9-4. The Kings allowed 5 goals in the second period to let this one get away from them. Terry Sawchuk was in net for the Kings. He allowed 9 goals on 33 shots. For the 9th most disappointing playoff loss in Kings history, we go to the very next year, the 1969 playoffs, second round this time. Game 4 in Los Angeles, and the Kings had just come off winning their first ever playoff series. They beat the Oakland Seals in 7 games, winning that Game 7. But then they followed up that big first ever playoff series win by being swept out of the second round of the playoffs by the St. Louis Blues, losing in game number 4 by a score of 4-1. Eddie Joyce had the Kings' only goal, gave them a 1-0 lead in the first period, but that was it. LA goalie Gary Desjardins allowed 4 goals on 23 shots. For the 8th most disappointing playoff loss in Kings history, we go to 1976. Second round, Game 7 in Boston. The Kings had just come off a thrilling Game 6 victory at home, even up their series against the Bruins at 3-3. Mike Corrigan had 2 third-period goals to tie it, and then Butch Goring won Game 6 in overtime. However, in Game 7, it was all Bruins as they won the game 3-0. LA only mustered 15 shots on goal, while goalie Rogie Vachon allowed 3 goals on 38 shots. Checking in at number 7, we go to the 2002 playoffs, first round, Game 7 in Denver. The Kings, the 7th seed in the West, had won 2 straight games to force a deciding Game 7 on the road against the number 2 seed in the West, the Colorado Avalanche. Unfortunately, Game 7 was all Colorado. A 4-0 home win as Patrick Waugh had a 23-save shutout for Colorado. Number 6 most disappointing loss in Kings history, the 2013 playoffs, Western Conference Finals, Game 5 in Chicago. The Kings are the defending Stanley Cup champs, but they trail in the series to the Blackhawks 3-1. Kings have to win to stay alive, and thanks to Mike Richards' goal with 9.4 seconds left, the Kings would tie it and force overtime at 3-3. Nothing decided in the first overtime. We go to a second overtime where Patrick Kane would not only end the game in sudden death, but wrap up a hat trick with his 3rd goal of the game. Chicago wins it 4-3 and would go on to win their 2nd Stanley Cup in 4 years. Now the Kings would get their revenge on Chicago the very next season with a Game 7 overtime road win on their way to winning their 2nd Stanley Cup in 3 years. And I have said that Game 7 in 2014 was the most stressful sporting event I have ever watched. Sudden death to decide whether you go to the Stanley Cup Finals or your season is over. And if you recall that year, it was pretty obvious that Chicago and LA were the 2 best teams in the NHL. And you really felt whoever won that game was going to win the Stanley Cup. And that is, in fact, what happened. Fortunately, it was the LA Kings in 2014. But in 2013, it was the Chicago Blackhawks beating the Kings in the Western Conference Finals. That was the 6th most disappointing playoff loss in Kings history. How about number 5? Let's go to the 2001 playoffs, second round, Game 7 in Denver. The 7th-seeded Kings lost with 1 win away from going to the Western Conference Finals, and they lose to the number 2 seed in the West, the Colorado Avalanche. 5-1 was the final. Rob Blake scored the first goal of the game for Colorado. He had left the LA Kings and was playing for the Avalanche at that time. The game was tied 1-1 going into the 3rd period, but the Avalanche scored 4 third-period goals to end the Kings' surprising run. Colorado would go on to win the Stanley Cup that season. Now, that season for the LA Kings was a pretty unexpected one. Nobody thought they would beat the Detroit Red Wings in the first round of the playoffs. That postseason series featured the frenzy on Figueroa. You might know about that or not. I was actually at this game up until they won the Stanley Cup. It was the greatest Kings win I ever saw in person. It's still in the top 10 of that. But it was a Game 4 comeback win against the Red Wings. LA was down 3 goals in the final 6 minutes of the third period. They tie it up, force overtime, and then Eric Belanger won it with a sudden death goal. So the Kings were riding high, and then they take, again, a really good Colorado team to 7 games, but lose to end what looked like it might have been a Cinderella run. And that was the deepest the Kings had gotten into the playoffs since another surprising run back to the Stanley Cup final in 1993. So those are numbers 10 through 5 as the most disappointing playoff losses in Kings history. I have not mentioned any of the playoff losses from this past season. Spoiler alert, there's going to be a couple of them in the top 5. We will give you it's the top 4. I just gave you number 5. The top 4, we will give you those games coming up here next on Locked On LA Kings, your team every day. There is nothing like playoff hockey. The energy, the rivalries, the nonstop action with the Stanley Cup playoffs heating up. There is never a better time to see it live, and Game Time makes getting in the building fast and affordable. Game Time gives you last-minute ticket deals, zone deals for deep discounts, panoramic seat views, and all-in pricing with no hidden fees. Plus, ticket prices often drop the closer you get to puck drop, so you can score big without overpaying. See my exact seat view before checkout. Gives me total confidence. Game Time also has fees up front and backs every order with their ticket coverage guarantee, covering cancellations and even offering 24-hour returns. And speaking of planning ahead, the NFL schedule is now out, and I am planning my fall calendar and picking which games I'm going to go to. Game Time makes scoring NFL tickets just as easy. Take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use the code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account, redeem the code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off. Download the Game Time app today. Last minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed. All right, I don't know if you're enjoying this or not, but we are counting down the worst playoff losses in LA Kings history. Hopefully it's at least kind of a history lesson. I don't know, maybe sharing our grief in this way is somehow helps the healing process. I don't know. But number 4 most disappointing loss in Kings playoff history. And it brings us to the 2025 playoffs. First round, Game 3 in Edmonton. After 2 wins on home ice for the Kings, taking a 2-0 series lead, Kings go on the road, and they led the Oilers 4-3 going into the third period. But in the third period, the Kings drop into a defensive shell. They stopped attacking. Edmonton tied the game on a controversial goal and then took the lead after a coach's challenge that never should have been for goalie interference. It was unsuccessful. It gave the Oilers a power play, and they ultimately would score 2 goals in a span of 10 seconds of game action. And poof, the lead was gone. Add a couple of empty net goals for the Oilers, and they skate off with a 7-4 win. They would then go on to win 4 straight in the series and eliminate the Kings. Evan Bouchard scored the game winner for the Oilers. Now, you might ask, how can this game be ranked ahead of some Game 7 losses? Surely those must be more disappointing. 7-game winner take all. Problem is, and I understand that logic, but the Game 7 losses we talked about earlier, 1976, 2001, 2002, the Kings were clear underdogs in those games. Not many people thought that they would even be in a position to play in a Game 7. Yeah, it's disappointing when you lose a Game 7, but again, when you're clearly the underdog, when you're clearly the higher seed, then I'm not saying it isn't disappointing, but I think it's much more disappointing when you are expected to win, when you're holding a lead going into the third period, which the Kings were in this game, and then you don't win. So to me, that makes this loss, and we're going to talk about another one in a moment, in this postseason more disappointing. Maybe I'm being a prisoner of the moment. That's up for you to make your judgment on that. The number 3 most disappointing playoff loss in Kings history, 2021 playoffs, first round, game 6 in LA. The Kings had a 3-2 series lead over the Edmonton Oilers and could close it out with a win on home ice in game 6. The Kings fell behind 2-0, but tied up the game on goals from Sean Durzi and Carl Grundstrom, former King greats. And the game was tied 2-2 in the third period, but Tyson Barrie would score to give the Oilers the lead, and then Evander Kane would ice the victory with an empty net goal. The Oilers win the game 4-2. Jonathan Quick allowed 3 goals on 36 shots. It was the last home game ever for Kings legend Dustin Brown, as he would announce his retirement before the postseason, and then the Kings would go on to lose game 7 in Edmonton, and they were then eliminated. This was the first of the 4 straight meetings in the playoffs between the Kings and the Oilers. And this was the only time in those 4 consecutive playoff meetings the Kings had a chance to eliminate the Oilers on home ice, and they did not get the job done in game 6. And then they go on and lose the game 7. But to me, while game 7 certainly is a disappointing loss, and maybe you could certainly argue it should be on this list, to me, game 6 is more disappointing because, again, the Kings had a chance to close it out on home ice and did not do it. Game number 2, we're back to 2025. First round, game 4 in Edmonton. Kings held a 3-1 lead in the game, had a chance to go up 3-1 in the series, but allowed 2 third-period goals, including the game-tying goal with 29 seconds left in regulation. And the Kings then go on to lose the game in overtime, and of course, went on to lose the series in 6 games. Game 3 was tough. Game 4 was even worse, and especially after seeing how not to play in the third period of game 3 made it even more maddening that the Kings came right back into the same thing in game number 4. Now, maybe if Quentin Byfield clears the zone, if maybe he shoots it into an empty net, then we're not having this conversation at all. Certainly no guarantees if the Kings, were up 3-1 in the series that they're going to close it out, but having 2 chances on home ice to wrap up the series, feel pretty good about their chances in that scenario. And for me, personally, this is the most disappointing playoff loss in Kings history. I don't ever recall being this upset over a Kings loss. Now, that might seem a bit crazy, but all the circumstances surrounding it, being what I thought was the better team, having a chance to finally get the monkey off your backs, being just 29 seconds away from 3-1, and it ends up 2-2. It took me a couple of weeks to get over that loss, and I'm not saying I'm completely over it at this point. Sort of, mostly, yeah, kind of. But again, for me, losing game 4 in the playoffs in Edmonton this year, for me personally, this was the worst playoff loss in Kings history. But it's not my number 1 because I do take history into account, and that was the first round. Our number 1 most disappointing playoff loss in Kings history takes us to the 1993 playoffs, the Stanley Cup final. Game 2 in Montreal, the Kings held a 1-0 series lead after beating the Canadiens in game 1 on the road 4-1. Kings leading in game 2 late in the third period by a score of 2-1. And then Montreal head coach Jacques Demers called for an illegal stick measurement of the stick of Marty McSorley, which I honestly don't know if that's even allowed anymore. Now, I know there is such thing of players having an illegal stick. I can't remember the last time that a coach asked for a measurement and the referees took the stick and went over and measured it. I still remember clearly in my mind this happening in game 2 of the 1993 Stanley Cup playoffs. They had like this protractor looking thing on the bench, the referees did, and they took Marty McSorley's stick and they went over there and they took that protractor thing and they put it up to the blade and they were looking. And they were like, yep, illegal. So the Canadiens get a power play. They pulled goalie Patrick Waugh for the extra attacker, a 6-on-4 power play. And sure enough, they would tie up the game and it would go into overtime where the Canadiens would win 3-2. Now, if the Kings hold on in that final minute 45, they win both games on the road, head home with a 2-0 series lead. Again, no guarantee the Kings would have won, but the odds of being up 2-0, heading home for the next two, would have obviously been hugely in the favor of the Kings. I am convinced, and there's no proof, obviously I can't prove it. I am convinced if the Kings win that game, if Marty McSorley does not have that illegal stick, if the Canadians do not score on the power play and tie it up and then win it in overtime, I am convinced the LA Kings would have won the Stanley Cup in 1993. But that didn't happen. And again, for me, though, this is not the most disappointing loss in Kings playoff history for me. Now, why would I say that? Well, this was the first year I was a true Kings fan. I had dabbled in it a little bit, but just, I guess, luckily for me, or maybe not luckily for me, the first year I decided I'm going to be a Kings fan and I am following this team from beginning to end was the year the Kings went on this Cinderella run to the Stanley Cup final. I remember clearly being amazed at playoff hockey and going on this journey with this team, and the Game 7 in Maple Leaf Garden in Toronto where Gretzky gets the hat trick. That year really helped to make me a fan of hockey and a fan of the LA Kings. But it was my first year, and I was disappointed. I was sad. I'm like, this sucks. But I'm like, we'll be back next year. I didn't know. I didn't have the history with the Kings. So I just kind of thought, this is a good team. They've gone to the Cup final. They'll use this experience. They'll be back again next year. Well, it didn't happen for about 20 years. But eventually they did get back to the Stanley Cup and win not one, but two. So while this isn't my most disappointing loss as a Kings fan, I think if you're talking about the history of the Kings, it has to be, because it's the Stanley Cup final, the most disappointing loss in Kings history. Fortunately, though, the Kings have a couple of cups, so now it's not as bad for people that were around and actually do remember that. All right. If you want to chime in on this list, let me know probably what you don't agree with, or if there's something I missed. We do have a fan feedback show every Friday. If there's something I didn't include, if there was something that was more disappointing, if the ranking wasn't to your liking, you can chime in if you want. This was for fun, I guess. Hopefully it was a little bit cathartic to kind of talk about these things, get it out there, and I don't know, maybe move on. But that was my top 10 most disappointing playoff losses in King history. And I think that games 3 and 4 from this postseason are in the top 10 of the LA Kings all time. All right, for you everydayers, those of you listen to watch Locked On LA Kings every day, on our next show, it is our Kings fan feedback show, your chance to ask questions or tell me what's on your mind regarding any of our shows from the past week, any of the things we talked about, or something else that's just on your mind. It's your chance to chime in. The email address is lockedoneddie@gmail.com, EDDIE. You're always welcome to post your thoughts if you're watching on YouTube in the comment section as well. And we'd love for you to stay interactive with the show on social media, X, Twitter, Instagram, TikTok. We are at Locked On LA Kings. I hope you enjoyed this. We'll see. I don't know. It was just an idea I had and I ran with it, but hopefully you appreciated this and talking about the worst playoff losses in Kings history. I'm Eddie Garcia. Thank you for listening and watching Locked On LA Kings, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your teams every day. Have a great rest of your day. We'll talk to you next time. And as always, go Kings go.